We're very fortunate today to be with Michael Gerhardt, who is the Burton Craig University Distinguished Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of North Carolina School of Law in Chapel Hill. We'd like to learn a little bit about your expertise today on impeachment. And first question is, in congressional testimony late last year, you said that our Constitution secures, quote, the fundamental principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. So in your estimation, is breaking the law, any law, grounds for impeachment?
Not necessarily. It depends on what the law is. It depends upon the circumstances. So in the law of impeachment, not all crimes are impeachable, and not all impeachable offenses are crimes. We have to look at the particular offense, and to borrow language from the framers, we have to ask whether it's an abuse of power, seriously injures the republic, or is it breach of the public trust.
That part, seriously injures the public, is this separation of powers, is that an area where it could constitute, do you think, a serious?
Yes. So impeachment is the one mechanism Congress has to hold a president in check for certain kinds of serious misconduct.
So should our interpretation of high crimes and misdemeanors and this approach to impeachment, should it evolve or should it be as originally constructed?
Well, it's going to turn out to be both. So the language, other high crimes and misdemeanors, is not arbitrary. The framers picked it for a reason. It had narrowed the class of offenses for which impeachable offenses could be removed from office. And our American system is distinct from the British system. In the British system, the king could not be impeached, and anyone could be impeached by Parliament except the king for anything.
Wow.
And Parliament could impose any punishment it thought fit, including death, on someone who was impeached. So the American system was purposely distinguished from that. They made the president impeachable. He was not above the law, so to speak. He was not beyond accountability, even in Congress. And the language of the high crimes and misdemeanors was meant to refer to what the British understood and what the framers understood as political crimes. These are the kinds of offenses people in high office could commit by virtue of their position. So a regular citizen, of course, might be subject to all kinds of laws. But a regular citizen can't interact with the leaders of foreign countries. A regular citizen can't lie about a treaty and get the Senate to ratify. A regular citizen can't pardon people with whom that person happens to be in criminal concert. The president has these unique powers, and therefore he can abuse them uniquely. And it's that abuse that becomes the focus of impeachment.
There's been some talk about whether the Senate might try to, they probably won't, censure the president. What's your thought on censure as a form of punishment?
Well, I've long been on the record about censure. I even testified about it last summer on July 12th in a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee on constitutional options for addressing presidential misconduct. And I think censure is a legitimate alternative that either chamber of Congress may use to censure or declaim something the president's done as bad. All that censure really consists of is a resolution. Resolution of either chamber. And each chamber passes resolutions all the time. Happy Arbor Day or whatever, whoever won the National Football Championship that year. So censure is not really any different. It's just saying the Secretary of whatever, the President of the United States, or somebody else has done something bad, or we are hereby denouncing this as inappropriate, or whatever the censure reads.
You mentioned testifying on the House Judiciary Committee, and you've been called to testify at 2 impeachment hearings over 21 years. I think you're the only person.
One of two.
One of two. Yeah. When you went to the Hill most recently in December, or even more recently than that, what, if anything, struck you as different compared to your time there back in 1998?
So in 1998, I was called by both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, as a joint witness to appear before the House Judiciary Committee. Fast forward 20 years later, there was never going to be agreement on each side on who would ever testify. That's one big difference. The second is, I think, even though we thought 1998 was a time of great political divide, the divide was much greater this time. Back in 1998, the focus was on the law of impeachment. So when people asked me questions, even Republicans or even people who didn't agree with what I thought, they asked me about my work or what I'd written about impeachment, which is all fair game. This time, Republicans were only interested in personal attacks. So
they're trying to cut you down.
Or they'll cut anybody down. There were a couple other witnesses whom they also sought to attack personally. Not really substantively, but just going after them personally, much like the president would. And I think that's a very different thing that was happening 20 years ago.
Do you think that the presence of Trump, whenever he leaves office, will change the tenor? Or do you think that it's more of this is the new norm?
I don't know. It's a great question, but we don't know the answer yet. I think it is something that pre-existed Trump. That is to say, people were already being divided and torn apart or moved apart or whatever, however one wants to describe it. But I think President Trump's tried to take advantage of that, and so he's stoking the fears and the hatreds of one side against the other. Whether or not any other president can perform better, that is to say, be more civil and more respectful toward disagreement, remains to be seen.
Over the past 50 years, many presidents or their administrations have been the subject of formal investigations, often initiated by the opposition party. Is this what the founders intended? I mean, taking it a step back and saying, if a party believes that the other party is acting in an egregious fashion, is it the responsibility of our legislative bodies to investigate?
Well, of course, the framers did not envision political parties. They were concerned with factions. Factions were essentially groups of self-interested parties or people who would rally around something that was of concern solely to them. And so the Constitution was set up to prevent factional tyranny. And then shortly after the Constitution went into effect, political parties were founded. So those parties have to some extent taken the place of factions. And over time, those parties have grown stronger, and I think essentially grown into tribes or factions where they take no prisoners. And it's vanquish or be vanquished. And that's what we're seeing right now. And it makes it harder to do what the Constitution was designed to do, which was to reach compromise and deliberation and negotiation over hard issues. Instead, it's let's call the other person names and let's denigrate his religion or denigrate whoever he or she is. And that's not what the framers anticipated. They were hoping the system would produce more civil, considered deliberation rather than name-calling. And so politically, and perhaps constitutionally, we're going to have to work ourselves out from under that.
I'm wondering, given the fact that you came of age, if that's fair to say, during Nixon's administration, that looking back on that time and the crisis that we were in as a republic, how would you speak to people today who didn't live through that time in terms of connecting the dots between then and now? How do we make sense of today, given what you experienced?
Well, I have a piece that just came out at the very same time today in the Atlantic that sort of begins by comparing the Nixon impeachment with the Trump, and it will seem as if, for those who were not alive during the Nixon era, it will seem as if that is a long time ago. It will sound fanciful. It will sound like fiction to people today. But at the time, when Nixon was reelected, he was reelected by a tremendously large advantage. Nonetheless, the House of Representatives and the Senate each separately began to initiate proceedings focusing on his possible misconduct in relationship to a burglary of the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. Those investigations in each chamber took about 2 years. It's almost impossible to imagine we could have those investigations like that now, taking 2 years and not being undermined for some partisan way. Beyond that, there was also a special prosecutor who was then charged with looking at Nixon's possible misconduct. So we had 3 different things. Right. The House, the Senate, and the special prosecutor all doing that. And the conventional wisdom on the Watergate era is that the system worked. The constitutional system worked. Impeachment was actually worked as it was intended to. Careful, deliberate fact-finding by each chamber of Congress, and then eventually the Supreme Court even got involved, where it was ordering Nixon to comply with the judicial subpoena, turn over taped conversations in the White House. So you had the Supreme Court and Congress both, in a sense, opposing Nixon and ordering him to do various things. And eventually the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. And then shortly thereafter, Nixon resigned. If we fast forward to the present, I think one way to understand what's been happening with President Trump is he has done what Nixon has done and more. And he's proven, in a sense, I think, the system doesn't work. So Nixon was willing to recognize law as a limitation and recognize that impeachment had some integrity to it. In fact, he ordered most of the people in his White House to comply with subpoenas and come testify. John Dean, who was the White House counsel at the time, complied with the subpoena and came to testify. Well, President Trump learned from Nixon's mistakes and said, no, I'll order everybody not to cooperate with subpoenas, and including his White House counsel. And
playing chicken, essentially, with the other 2 branches of government.
it could be playing chicken or just defiance. Just saying you can't touch me, in part because I've got my party in control in the Senate, and they're not going to convict me. And he's also stacked the judiciary. And so that could end up working to his advantage as well. So I think the lesson from President Trump's trial is a very different lesson than the one from Nixon's situation. Nixon's situation, we often take the lesson that the system worked. I think with President Trump, maybe the lesson is we've got to re-examine the system.
Well, a few years after Nixon, you started to see the dawn of conservative talk radio, and you started to see a counterweight to what was perceived to be a more left-leaning network news organization. And I'm wondering whether, if Nixon were president now, given what he did, do you think, and of course revisionist history is impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, do you think that he would have been protected, essentially, from a 2-year investigation?
To some extent he would have been. I mean, he would have been able to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to attack the media and attack the news. Nixon did that to some extent, but I think by the time we get to President Trump, the rise of the internet, the rise of the 24/7 news coverage, I think talk radio, a system now in which people go to the different news outlets that reinforce their opinions, and so people are not as educated as much by the news as they are reinforced in their caves or wherever they happen to live in their opinions. And President Trump has been relatively effective at mobilizing his base to oppose whatever the news disseminates. He's the arbiter of truth, not the news. If he says that the sun doesn't rise this morning, his party believes that.
Publicly?
Yeah.
And I guess that's the distinction, right? Do you think if there were an anonymous vote, I think Senator Manchin might have mentioned this, or somebody, if impeachment were anonymous, do you think Trump would have been impeached?
I've never bought into what I think is a myth, that somehow if Republicans behind the scenes are all complaining about Trump and fearful of Trump, I just don't know if that's true or not. I find that hard to take as true, because that would mean they're terrific actors publicly. And I just don't know that we are blessed, so to speak, with political actors that are so wonderful when it comes to theatrics. You know, that they are worthy of Oscars in terms of their performance. Because it seems to me they appear to be believing what they're saying, and believe in the fact that, according to what Republican senators are saying, Republican members in the House are saying, is that all ills in America are caused by Democrats. It's a great surprise to learn that Democrats had so much power that they are responsible for every ill in the universe. But according to Republicans, that's the case. That's what the president's saying.
2 very quick questions, if I can. One, let's say a Democratic president beginning in 2021, they do something that is egregious, whether willfully or someone on their staff or in their cabinet, and Republicans say, all right, this is the new metric now. You did this to our president, we're going to do this to you. Is that, thinking nonpartisanly, is that justified? Is that where we are now, where future presidents need to be mindful of the fact that maybe this is an anomaly and this might not be allowed to happen again? Or is that foolish to think?
I don't know what might happen, except that I think if we ever do get a Democratic president, which may just be fanciful, but assuming we ever do get a president who's Democrat and Republicans control one chamber or the other, what we have to expect would happen is that if the Republican Party remains the same as it is, then they will look at this in a tribal way and say, well, our tribe now has to go kill you. That's what we need to do. It doesn't matter what the facts are.
Right.
We will go kill you because you're a Democrat.
Right.
And that is all completely inconsistent with the checks and balances the Constitution set up. The Constitution was set up with the idea that the citizenry would become educated and become enlightened by facts. They would not depend on their political leaders to tell them, here are the facts you should believe.
Right.
No, the people were supposed to be able to independently develop enough education and respect for the truth that they could hold their leaders accountable when they deviated from their duties. And so one element of our system of checks and balances is that the public isn't fooled by their leaders. Another part of the checks and balance system was to believe not just in facts, but to believe in law. And law is something that constrains leaders. Mm-hmm. So I, in good faith, testified that I thought the President of the United States abused his power. And the appropriate sanction for that is impeachment. That's the process set up to deal with abuse of power. So I don't buy into the premise that this was just all about politics and all about political parties' differences. I think, for better or worse, I think the Democrats took a position they thought was grounded in the law. Incidentally, if you had asked constitutional law professors a year ago, could the President of the United States solicit a foreign country to help with his re-election, I think every law professor would have said, of course not.
And if you'd asked it maybe 4 years ago, where most Republicans would say,
yeah.
Of course not.
And I would point out that even in the current circumstances, to defend my profession, constitutional law, I don't see any movement in constitutional law from law professors saying, oh yeah, the president can do whatever he wants when he wants. Mm. The president can solicit foreign interference anytime he wants. You don't see law professors coalescing around that. There's consensus, right and left, among law professors, that there are boundaries on executive power, and this president broke them. Now, we may be in the minority in constitutional law, but I don't know of any law professor, I've certainly not encountered one yet, conservative or liberal, who says it's okay for the President of the United States to be beyond the reach of Congress. He can stymie impeachment. He can make up the law as he goes along, and there's no way to hold him accountable, even when he tries to undermine the electoral system. That's not in the Constitution, and I don't think constitutional law professors think that's in the Constitution.
Well, let me ask you one more question then, which is, have we outlived the part of the Constitution that says Congress should be investigating the president?
Well, we might well be in a situation where impeachment just is no longer effective. It's not clear impeachment ever was effective when it came to presidency. We've had 3 presidential impeachments that went through trials, and all 3 were acquitted. And the one president who resigned didn't go through the trial. Had he hung on, maybe he would have been convicted and removed, maybe not. Republicans like Barry Goldwater were saying he's going to be convicted and removed. But if we fast forward to today, the 2/3 threshold that's required to convict and remove the president just may be too high. It's never worked for the president. It's worked for lower court judges. It's only worked 8 times, all for lower court judges. So impeachment itself may be ineffective. And then that kind of raises the next big question, which is, what is the appropriate check on presidential misconduct?
Can you offer something as a parting gift? Something that you would like to see as a solution to checking the president?
I think there are two other possible checks, but it's not at all clear either one is effective. One is the media. You know, again, the framers believed in a media, so to speak, newspapers. Granted, the framers believed in partisan outlets at the time that they lived, but they believed to some extent that people would get educated by the media, by newspapers and others. So the media was a very important source, for example, against President Nixon. That's how it all started. It all started with newspapers breaking the story. And fast forward to President Trump, New York Times broke a story about all the tax fraud he had committed. And the impact was nil. Americans just seem to shrug their shoulders. Maybe because that's what they expect from this president, maybe because they don't trust the paper, maybe a combination of things. But one check is for the media, to hold leaders accountable, leaders of either party accountable. It's only possible if everybody believes in the facts. Mm-hmm. And then the other possible check is voting. Mm-hmm. That may explain why there's so much effort, I think again, perhaps particularly on the Republican side, to restrict voting, to undermine voting, to undermine access to voting. And the president himself is trying to manipulate that, tried to manipulate it against Joe Biden, is still trying to manipulate it against Joe Biden. And he's doing that in part to get rid of a political rival, and he's inventing dirt on Joe Biden, saying there's tremendous dirt out there in Ukraine. Now, authoritative people, like Fiona Hill, one of the experts on Russia, testified that that's Russian propaganda. And every expert we know says that's Russian propaganda. But the Republican Party thinks that's the truth. And they think that's the truth because the president wants it to be the truth.
Do they hope it's the truth? Is it more, and I'm at...
Yeah, it's fair. It's fair. They may hope it's true, but if we believe our eyes and believe what we hear and believe our senses, it's Russian propaganda. It served the Russian interest to make it seem as if Ukraine's responsible for whatever happened in 2016. And I think at some point, if voting is going to work, the American people have to believe not what they're told, but what they can see with their own eyes and feel with their own hands and read themselves.
Michael, thank you very much. Really enjoyed this. Again, this is Michael Gerhardt, the Barton Craig University Distinguished Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Really appreciate your time today.